Let's bring in Joel Burnie, Executive Manager of AIJAC. Joel, last week we marked the first anniversary of the October 7 terror attacks. And on the eve of the anniversary, an American law professor said that October 7 is a day of considerable celebration at a pro-Palestinian rally. Let's listen to that.
I want to echo what one of the brothers said earlier today, is that today is not fully a day of mourning. In many respects, today is also a day that marks considerable celebration, considerable progress, and in some respects, considerable privilege.
Arizona State University Associate Professor Khaled Beydoun has been sent home after being told that his visa was going to be cancelled. Joel, can I get your reaction?
Thanks for having me again, Gabriella. My first initial reaction is to give credit where credit's due to the federal government and the Minister for Immigration and Home Affairs, Tony Burke, for cancelling the visa of this professor from the United States. His comments are unfortunately not unfamiliar to my community since the horrific events of just over a year ago on October 7. We had people in the streets that same afternoon and early evening in Sydney and Lakemba, lighting fireworks, and certain people saying how elated they were of the day. So for someone to call it a day of celebration is unfortunately not surprising. But here's the juxtaposition that I want to focus on in this case. So firstly, we had, for the first time in a long time, an example of leadership from our political leaders to actually do something about this. So cancelling the visa, revoking the visa, and sending this guy home was the right course of action. So it does clearly show that there is space for leadership and for political leadership to do things to remove the toxins of this social, this lack of social cohesion that we've had since October 7. It is not appropriate for people to come out to the streets of our beautiful country, Gabriella, and say the things that they've been able to get away with over the past 12 months. So the fact that action has been taken, I think it's critically important to show that firstly, it can be done. It can be done also by this current Labor federal government, and it should be done more often to discourage this type of behaviour that has unfortunately taken over our streets over the past 12 months.
Absolutely. Well said, Joel. There are reports that Israel's response to Iran's missile bombardment is now ready and could occur before the US election. What can we expect?
I think the first point is to remember that only just over 2 weeks ago, there were 181 ballistic missiles that were sent from Iran into Tel Aviv and into Israel, into the center of Israel, into lots of different parts. And we're talking about very large missiles here. They're the larger type, huge payloads, and if it had not been for the majority successful interceptions, the damage to Israel could have been far more significant than what it was. So the predicate for a response, for a retaliatory strike, is clearly there. Obviously, Australia wouldn't tolerate 181 very large ballistic missiles coming into its territory, and Israel won't tolerate it either. So there's conjecture as to what type of sites will be targeted. I'm none the wiser, Gabriella, as I'm not in the situation room there in Israel. But you can expect that the response will be large in its strike. It may avoid and will probably avoid the nuclear facilities under some type of agreement with the United States, with the Biden administration. So I think the green light to strike before the general election, the first week of November, is there with this current administration. But Israel will respond, and will respond in kind, and make sure will hit Iran hard, and will make sure that it deters and discourages Iran from launching those ballistic missiles at Israel again.
Israel says it's reviewing an ultimatum issued from America, which warns that military aid could be reduced unless the humanitarian situation in Gaza improves. And the letter grants Israel 30 days to improve the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Joel, what's your response to accusations from the US that Israel isn't providing enough aid to Gaza?
Well, I think that as Benjamin Netanyahu has pushed back on this, and other senior members of the security cabinet have pushed back as well, is that there is a significant amount of humanitarian aid going into Gaza, and there has been since day one. The bottleneck of the humanitarian aid in Gaza is a twofold massive problem between the distribution agencies that are under control of the United Nations, that there's a massive bottleneck once the aid gets into Gaza. And then ultimately, unfortunately, Gabriella, those that are in charge of the distribution are still networks connected to Hamas. So Hamas is profiting off the aid that's going through, restricts it when it wants to, and then pulls the strings of, pulls the tugs of the emotional tugs of world leaders to gain sympathy by a false accusation of starvation. In this case, it seems as though that the United States administration is taking it seriously and asks for increased aid. I'll note that in the past 48 hours, over 50 massive semi-trailer trucks have entered into specifically into northern Gaza to increase that aid. So look, on the practical point of view, I'm confident that Israel will find ways and means of getting more aid to the people, but it's not necessarily a matter of no aid going into the enclave. There is a significant amount of aid in the Strip at the moment. It's the distribution of that aid, complicated by Hamas's insistence on, with its own violent and military means, to control those aid convoys, to maintain its control over the people and use it as a profiting scheme to continue to amass its coffers, to continue the influence and control that it has on the streets of Gaza. So I think you will see a practical increase of aid and aid channels, but it's not just on Israel's responsibility. The United Nations has a huge responsibility in the distribution of this aid, and nations like Australia should call out the bad behavior of terror organizations like Hamas that is ultimately the ones who are responsible for the lack of distribution of aid in the enclave.
Hamas leader Sinwar hasn't been seen in around a year. What's happening there?
So again, on this one, Gabriella, your guess is as good as mine, but the fact that it seems as though that the communication channels between Sinwar and his network in Gaza to get his message out has been significantly limited over the past couple of weeks. I think the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and then the follow-up assassination of Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut is a clear indication, not just to Sinwar, but lots of bad types in that region, that it doesn't matter where you hide, it doesn't matter how deep underground you are, and also doesn't matter how many hostages that you protect yourself with. Ultimately, the pressure will come down on you, and I'm confident that Israel will ultimately find Sinwar and bring him to justice. But I think it highlights the issues that the military campaign in Gaza has taken a while. However, it seems to be quite successful in reducing and nearly incapacitating the military arm and the military capabilities of Hamas. And I think that's not only good things for the millions of people in Israel, but that's a good thing for the millions of people in Gaza, for the Palestinian people, and for the region as a whole.
Finally, the US election is going to be held in less than 3 weeks now. What's your assessment of what this means for Israel?
This is a big election for Israel, Gabriella. It's rather historic. To be fair to Kamala Harris, her statements during the campaign have been rather consistent with the position of the Biden administration. However, she's not Joe Biden. She doesn't have that 4-decade-long history and friendship with Israeli leaders and Israel as a country as well. She doesn't have that history. She doesn't have that type of emotional connection. That's not to discredit her as a potential friend of Israel, but it marks a difference between her as an individual and President Biden. In terms of the potential President Trump victory, I think that many in Israel are uncomfortable with the dichotomy of knowing that a Trump presidency is most likely and most probably going to be beneficial to Israel in the long term, whilst also balancing that with the issues that plagued the presidency before. Israelis and Jews globally are acutely aware of what happens when there's a vacuum of leadership and what happens when there isn't strong leadership that's backing your ally. So in the context of the United States, and in the previous question that you asked about this 30-day ultimatum, I don't think that type of communication, language, or pressure would be exerted by a Republican administration like it has been by a Democrat administration. So let's just focus very importantly on what's happened in the past 3 to 4 weeks. Israel has essentially begun a transformation within the region that is essentially changing the map by going into southern Lebanon, by significantly weakening Hezbollah, which was thought to be very, very difficult before, fighting on multiple fronts. Now is the time that we can actually get a safe and prosperous Middle East that we've always been aiming for since the horrific events of September 11. So Israel in the past 4 weeks has made such significant military gains that you've got 2 very large terror organizations on the ropes, namely Hezbollah and Hamas. And also you've got the head of the snake, Iran, in a very precarious and weak position. This is the time for the Western allies to unite together to reshape the region, for the betterment of the Gulf states, for the betterment of a reformed Iraq, for the betterment, obviously, of a prosperous and safe Lebanon, which everyone hopes and dreams about. This is a real moment in history, and I feel as though that a Republican administration might have more success in a long-term stabilizing and prosperity effort in the region than what a Kamala Harris presidency will have.
Joel Burnie, Executive Manager of AIJAC, thank you so much for joining us on Power Hour.
Thanks, Gabriella.